On the 11th of November 1845, a Milwaukee newspaper printed 4 short sentences. A schooner called the Ocean, lost with all hands, somewhere between Chicago and St. Joseph. No name of a wife, no name of a 5-year-old daughter waiting in a cabin in Brookfield, Wisconsin, for a father who was never coming home. That daughter grew up to be Ma Ingalls. Her name was Caroline Quiner. The calm that readers would one day mistake for her nature had a beginning, and you can point to it on a map. Hey guys, tonight the story stays with Caroline, long before the famous books, when she was a girl in Wisconsin. If these quiet evenings help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe, only if they truly do. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what hour it is there. If you'd like to keep a little of this, the Prairie Homestead Library waits at prairiesecrets.com, so settle in wherever the night has found you. Turn the lamp down as far as it will go, let your shoulders loosen, and if sleep arrives long before the ending does, let it. Nothing tonight asks to be remembered. The story runs along 3 sheets of paper that outlived almost everything else. A newspaper notice, a land receipt, and a teaching contract, and it will make itself plain as it goes. I'll keep watch. For now, Wisconsin. The cold end of autumn 1845. The paper that carried the news was an ordinary one. Shipping tables, grain prices, advertisements for boots and stove blacking, and low on the page a paragraph about a schooner that had not come in. The Milwaukee Sentinel ran the notice on the 11th of November. Its wording was careful, the way papers learn to be careful about the lake. The ocean had likely capsized some days earlier, it said. 4 bodies had washed ashore near St. Joseph, over on the Michigan side, and the paper supposed they belonged to the crew. No one aboard had survived. That was the whole of it. A few lines of type between the price of wheat and a notice about winter boots. Papers like that moved slowly out from the city, riding west in coat pockets and saddlebags, passed across store counters, read aloud by whoever could read to whoever was standing near the stove. Somewhere along that chain of hands, the news left the main road and turned up a farm lane outside Brookfield, maybe 15 miles west of Milwaukee, where a woman with 6 children was waiting on a man the lake had already kept. To understand what that paragraph broke, you have to see the household it was travelling toward. Caroline had been born 6 years earlier, on the 12th of December, 1839, the 5th child of Henry and Charlotte Quiner. Her full name was Caroline Lake Quiner. Families in those years often folded a place, or a grandmother, or a debt of friendship into a child's middle name and thought no more about it, and no record explains this one. The word simply sat there inside her name all her life, quiet as a stone in a field, years before the water it named took anything from her. I have always been a little haunted by that detail, and a little fond of it too. Brookfield then was new country. Wisconsin was not yet a state, only a territory filling up with wagons, and the land west of Milwaukee was a patchwork of oak openings and half-cleared fields, stumps still standing in the wheat. Milwaukee itself was young, a harbour town that had been mostly marsh and speculation 15 years earlier, and was now filling with masts, warehouses, land agents, and newcomers off every boat. Yankees from New England and New York, Germans, Irish, all of them pushing west along the same few rutted roads. The Quiners had a farm out along one of those roads, a cabin, cleared ground, animals to tend, and a family that seemed to grow with every second winter. By the autumn of 1845 there were 6 living children. Joseph was the oldest, 11 that fall. After him came Henry Odin, then Martha Jane, then Caroline, then little Eliza Ann, and finally Thomas Lewis, the baby, not yet a year old. There had been one more, a first daughter named Martha Morse, who died in infancy before Caroline was born. Losses like that were common then, and the record barely pauses over her. Families did pause, Of course, they just did it privately and kept going because the cows still needed milking either way. 8 people then in a territory farmhouse, and the year turning around them on the old wheel. Sugar snow and sap buckets at the end of winter, ploughing in the wet spring, the garden and the hoeing and the long green push of summer, then harvest, then the slaughter weather, then the wood and the dark and the year's accounts, and around again. A household that size ran on work the way a stove runs on wood, and everyone above the age of walking fed something into it. Water carried, kindling gathered, wool picked, corn shelled, a baby minded so the grown hands could stay busy. A farm childhood at 5 was made of small commissions like those, and of the spaces in between, feeding hens and hunting eggs, standing on a stool to stir, trailing the big sisters being trailed by the little ones. It is easy, from this distance, to make such a childhood sound either grim or golden, and it was mostly neither. It was ordinary, in a place and time where ordinary was one fresh every day. Whatever else Caroline's first years held, no diary survives to tell us, and this story will not put words in a small girl's mouth. What survives is the shape around her. A full table, a father alive, an ordinary farm in an ordinary November which is its own kind of wealth, though nobody ever writes it down at the time. At the centre of that household stood Charlotte Wallace Tucker Quiner, born in 1809, in her middle 30s by the autumn this story turns on. The record keeps her thin too, in these early years, the way it keeps most farm wives thin, a name in family papers, a line in other people's stories. But hold on to her, because she is about to become the main character of this act, and she will earn it. Everything the next several years asked of that family landed first on her, and what she did with it is one of the best documented and least told parts of the whole Little House prehistory. For now, in that last ordinary autumn, she was simply a wife with 6 children, a garden put to bed, and a husband away at Milwaukee visiting family. Of Henry Quiner himself the record keeps less than you would want. He had been born in 1807, which made him a man in his late 30s that autumn, with a wife, 6 children, and a farm still half made. He was not a lake man by trade. The best supported account has him in Milwaukee in the fall of 1845 visiting family, and family is also what put him on the water. His brother-in-law, a man named Alexander McGregor, was master of a schooner called the Ocean, working the lumber trade on Lake Michigan. When the Ocean went out that November, Henry went with her, a passenger by most tellings, or an extra pair of hands. The record allows either and settles neither. It seems a small distinction, passenger or crew, but hold it a moment. A sailor accepts the water's terms every working day, and his family learns to live beside that bargain. Henry was a settled man standing on a deck mostly because a visit and a voyage happened to line up. Nobody at the cabin in Brookfield had learned to brace for the lake. Why would they? The lake was a road other families worked. Until that month it had never once asked the Quiners for anything. It helps to know what Lake Michigan was in those years, because it was not scenery. It was the highway of the whole territory. Nearly everything a frontier town needed came over that water in wooden schooners, salt and stoves and window glass and barrels of pork, and nearly everything the territory sold went back out the same way. Wheat and hides and lumber, always lumber. Whole forests moving south a shipload at a time. The lake carried the mail. The lake carried the news. The lake carried relatives you had not seen in 10 years. Standing on a Milwaukee pier in 1845, you would have seen masts the way a modern person sees traffic. The schooners that did this work were not grand ships. Most were small, hard-used, worked by a handful of men, built to make money in a short sailing season, and repaired over the winter with whatever the season had earned. From the first thaw to the freeze-up, they ran as many trips as wind and daylight allowed, because when the ice closed the harbours, every hull on the lake stopped earning at once. That arithmetic mattered most in the fall. The last runs of the year paid well precisely because fewer masters wanted to make them, with the insurance men wary and the weather owed. Every port on the lake kept its own quiet count of ships that had reached for one voyage too many. And November was the month the bargain turned. The water still held its summer warmth while the air arriving from the north had already gone over to winter, and when those two met, the lake could raise a gale in an afternoon. Sailors knew the season by name and by reputation. There were no forecasts, no wires, no warnings posted from shore. There was the colour of the sky, the feel of the wind backing around, the barometer if a captain owned one, an experience which was real knowledge but not protection. A schooner caught out in the open in a November gale had few choices, and none of them good. Run before it and hope the sea room lasted. Claw for a harbour and hope the harbour could be entered in the dark. Or take the water aboard, wave by wave, until the cargo shifted or the seams opened, and the lake decided the question itself. Late season on the lakes produced the same story every year, told in different names. A vessel overdue, a town waiting, cargo and timbers coming ashore 50 miles from where anyone expected. The lakes did not give up their people the way the sea sometimes did. No currents carrying word to a far coast, no other shore. What went down in that cold, fresh water tended to stay. In the first days of that November, a gale came down Lake Michigan. The day the record best supports is believed to be the 6th of November, and even the newspaper hedged, saying only that the schooner had likely capsized some days before the notice ran. One later account, repeating an older family paper at second hand, gives an earlier year altogether. The notice printed the same week as the storm stands closer to the event, and this story stays with it. Somewhere on the run between Chicago and the St. Joseph shore, the ocean went down. What happened aboard her in the last hours, nobody living can say. The paper did not know. The family never learned. No log washed ashore. No witness survived. And it would be easy and wrong to invent the scene, the cold, the shouting, a man's last thought turning toward Brookfield. None of that is anywhere in the record. The honest version is shorter and harder. A ship went out with men aboard, a storm stood up in the middle of the lake, and the ship did not come in. News of a wreck travelled in the wrong order too. The storm itself arrived everywhere at once, rattling the same windows in Milwaukee and Brookfield alike. One more hard blow in a hard month. Nothing in it to tell a farm family that this particular wind was personal. Then days of nothing. A ship overdue was not yet a ship lost. Masters ran late for 100 reasons, sheltering behind a point, waiting out weather in some far harbour, and the lake had taught every port town the discipline of not morning early. Then the wreckage, the bodies on the Michigan shore, the word moving up the lake from town to town, and finally the paragraph in the paper, 5 days or more behind the fact. Whether anyone in Brookfield spent those days already uneasy, no one recorded. The lake kept its secret the whole time, and the household went on being a household with a father, right up until the moment it learned it had stopped being 1 day before. The water gave back 4 bodies near St. Joseph, and the paper supposed they were crewmen. Henry was never named among them. He was never brought home at all. There would be no funeral with him in it, no stone with him under it, no grave for a wife to tend or a daughter to visit. Nothing of his came back for the family to keep. Not the coat he sailed in, not a button off the coat, and the loss did not stop at one door. The Ocean's master, Alexander McGregor, was family himself, Henry's own brother-in-law, and all hands meant him too. The one storm reached into the one extended family twice, taking the man who commanded the deck and the man who was only visiting it. Grief like that does not divide cleanly between households, it pools. For the people left behind, that particular emptiness did its own slow damage. A death with a grave gives grief somewhere to stand. This one gave the Quiners a lake, 80 miles of grey water that went on being a road for other people's fathers, and a name in the middle of a little girl's name. How the news reached the farm no one wrote down. Whether a neighbour rode out with the paper folded in a pocket, whether Charlotte heard it first at the store in town, whether the children were in the room, the record is silent, and this is the one place in the story where guessing would be a mistake. You have stood in some version of that doorway, or you will. It does not need staging. What can be held steady is the arithmetic of the household that got the news. Charlotte Quiner was in her middle 30s. Around her were 6 children. The oldest was 11. The baby was not yet 1. Caroline was 5. Between the lot of them they could carry water, mind hens, shell corn, and love each other. And not one of those things would pay a debt, or clear a field, or stand between the family and the winter that was by then only weeks away. And the timing was its own quiet cruelty. November on a farm was settlement season. The harvest was in or it wasn't. The hogs were fat or they weren't. The year's credit at the store came due against the year's produce, and the winter's wood, months of it, wanted cutting and splitting and stacking before the deep cold shut the work down. It was the exact hinge of the year when a farm needed its grown man most, and that is the season the lake chose to take him. The wood was half laid in, the accounts were coming due, the snow was coming regardless. And then it came. Some night in that stretch of weeks, the first real snow of the winter settled over the territory, over the harbour at Milwaukee and the farm lane at Brookfield, and the long grey water in between, evening every rooftop, filling every rut. You know the particular hush a house takes on under its first deep snow, how the world outside goes soft and far away. In most years that hush is a comfort. In the Quiner cabin that year, it closed over a family still learning the new arithmetic of itself, and it did not ask whether they were ready. The books Caroline's daughter would one day write remember Ma as the calmest presence in every room, a woman whose composure seemed bottomless, almost weightless. Readers have loved her for it for 100 years, but composure like that is not standard issue. Somewhere it gets made, and if you were to go looking for the workshop, you would come here to a Wisconsin farmhouse in November of 1845, where a 5-year-old girl was learning, at the exact age when children learn things once and permanently, that the people who hold up the world can be subtracted from it in an afternoon, without warning, without a body, without goodbye. What she thought that night, no record says. What she did in the years after, the records do say, and that is the story worth staying awake for or drifting through, whichever your evening prefers. Caroline turned 6 a few weeks later in December, in the first winter without him. The snow came the way it always came. The lamp in the kitchen was lit each evening the way it always was, and around that small held flame, a household of 7 began learning what it now was, a widow, 6 children, 1 farm, 1 winter, and no plan yet. The door of that first grief closed softly behind them, and the work began. Morning still came early to a farm, even that winter. Whatever the night before had taken, the fire had burned down by dawn and wanted building up. The water pail stood empty. The animals waited in their stalls with the patient selfishness of all livestock, hungry on schedule, indifferent to everything else. There is a mercy hiding inside that indifference. A farm never once asks how you are. It asks what you have done since sunrise, and a person who is 5 or 11 or 36 can answer that question on the worst morning of her life, and feel, for 1 hour, ordinary. The day had a shape, and the shape held. Fire, water, stock, breakfast, and then the long middle of a winter day, mending and grinding and hauling. The baby passed from hip to hip, supper early because lamplight cost money, and then the banked fire and the dark. A territory winter ate wood at a frightening rate, something like a dozen cords between first frost and thaw, which is a wall of split oak longer than the cabin that burned it, and every stick of it had to be cut, hauled, split and stacked by somebody. That winter, for the first time, there was no grown man to be that somebody. So the Quiner household kept moving because standing still was not on the list of choices. But watch what the work was now standing on. Take one grown man out of a farm and the farm does not shrink to match. The fields are the same size. The woodpile burns just as fast. The daily mortgage of labour that a farm demands comes due every single morning, and the family paying it was now a woman in her 30s, a boy of 11, a boy of 10, a girl of 8, and a row of children below them, each one a mouth first and a pair of hands second. 8 plates on the table had become 7, and the plate that was gone had belonged to the person who earned most of what filled the other 6. That is the cold bookkeeping of it. In 1840s, Wisconsin was a place that kept exactly that kind of books. It is worth being plain about what a widow's position actually was out there, because the difference between then and now is the difference between a hard story and an incomprehensible one. There was no life insurance arriving in an envelope, not for a farmer lost as a passenger on his brother-in-law's schooner. There was no pension, no county relief check, no fund for the families of the drowned, and the law itself was built around a household shape like the one the Quiners no longer had. The people who have spent their lives with this period's records describe it this way. A married woman in the territory lived legally inside her husband's name. His signature held the land dealings, the store credit, the standing to buy and sell and owe. The old arrangements offered a widow her portion, famously a third of what her husband left, but a third of a half made Frontier Farm with debts against it was a fraction of a fraction. Widowhood handed Charlotte back her own signature at the precise moment the accounts were emptiest, and it handed her nothing else. What it certainly did not hand her was a way to earn like a man. The paid work open to a woman was sewing, washing, weaving, keeping hens, selling butter and eggs, and every one of those paid in pennies against a farm's expenses in dollars. Worse, the whole country out there was cash poor. Even prosperous families settled half their lives in barter, eggs against calico, labour against flour, and barter is a fine system for people with surplus and a slow ruin for people without. The store ledger did not forgive a balance because the man who signed it was under the lake. The tax bill did not come with a note of condolence. The world was not cruel to the Quiners in those years, not especially. It was merely exact, which for a widow amounted to nearly the same thing. Inside those limits, Charlotte ran the farm. It is easy to slide past that sentence, so stay with it a breath longer. Running a farm was never only labour, it was management, the unglamorous, unending work of deciding what to plant and how much, what to sell and when, which debt to pay first, which repair could wait another year, which could not, what a fair trade looked like when the man across the table knew you had no husband to consult. Henry's death had not only taken a worker from the fields, it had taken the other half of every decision and left all of them, every planting, every trade, every no, to a woman the law and the neighbourhood still expected to be quiet about it. She was not trained for it. Nobody trained wives for it. She did it anyway, for 2 years, with a baby on her hip, and the plainest proof that she did it is that the family was still there, still fed, still together, when those 2 years ended. The paper that named the ship had nothing to say about any of this. No paper did. What a widow with 6 children was supposed to do next was, by the general agreement of the age, her own private problem, hers and her neighbours' and God's, roughly in that order. The neighbours, at least, seem to have understood their place in that arrangement. Family memory holds that the people around the Quiners did what settled neighbours then did, which was to show up with what they could spare, hands at harvest, a little milk, a little meat, help with the heavy work that a boy of 11 could not do alone. Memory also holds that it was never enough to close the gap, only enough to keep the gap from swallowing anyone. Both of those things ring true together. Kindness was real on that frontier, and so was the limit of it, because the neighbours were poor too, and winter did not exempt a family for being generous. Most of what we can see inside the Quiner cabin in these 2 years comes through one narrow window, and honesty asks that the window be named before it is used. 80 years later, in 1925, Caroline's older sister Martha, by then an old woman, set down what she remembered of that childhood in letters to a niece who had become a famous writer. Letters like that are family memory, 8 decades downstream, written to be read. Memory at that distance smooths some things and brightens others, and no careful person treats it like a courtroom transcript. But it is also the only voice from inside that kitchen, and this story will lean on it lightly and label it every time it does. Martha remembered one that was daily and specific, a garden and a cow standing between 8 people and the cold, cornbread and milk when there was milk, maple sugar standing in for what the store would have sold them in seasons when there was no money for the store, the same Brookfield maples that had sweetened better years now covering for them, and stretches when supper was thinner than anyone at the table said out loud, and nobody asked for a second helping. She remembered clothing turned, patched, and handed down past the point where handing down usually stops. Nothing in what she set down is dramatic. That is rather the point. Hunger on a farm rarely arrives as an event. It arrives as a subtraction that never quite finishes, a table where there is always something, and never quite enough, and everyone is too polite and too tired to say so out loud. Notice the cow in that remembering, because a single cow was a whole economy. Milk while she gave it, butter to eat and butter to trade, a calf in the spring if luck held, and the difference, all winter, between children fed thin and children fed thinner. Families measured their standing in cows the way later ages would measure it in wages, and a widow down to 1 was a widow with exactly one thing left between her table and the worst. The garden was the other pillar, and a garden is faithful but seasonal. It feeds August generously and January not at all, except through whatever could be dried, buried in sand or put up against the cold. The remembered hunger of those years has a season in it for a reason. Winter was when the year presented its bill, and 6 growing children were a bill all by themselves, not through any fault, simply through the honest cost of growing. Feet lengthen past shoes in a single year, wrists outrun sleeves, cloth wears from the knees and elbows out, and there was no money for cloth, which is how a household arrives at sleeves turned, knees patched, and garments passed along far beyond the usual stopping place. In a family of 6 children, almost nothing was ever new, and almost nothing was ever quite warm enough in February. None of this was unusual on that frontier. That is worth saying twice. The Quiners were not a spectacle. They were one poor family among many, which meant no one was coming, because there was no one whose job it was to come. If tonight's title needs its 6 hungry years pointed to, this is where they begin. Not a term any archive uses, just the honest name for the stretch this family walked. From the November the lake took Henry to the year, still well ahead of us tonight, when the household's footing finally began to turn. 6 years is a long time. It is longer when you're small. Caroline spent the ages of 5 and 6 and 7 inside that subtraction, and the ages a child spends inside a thing become the child, quietly, the way weather becomes the shape of a tree. Here is one honest way to see it, offered gently and held loosely, because no document proves what went on inside a little girl. A house like that one has no spare anything. No spare food, no spare candle, no spare hour, and maybe above all no spare room for noise. A mother stretched across 6 children, and a failing ledger cannot carry tantrums on top of everything else, and nobody has to say so for every child in the house to know it. Children in such houses learn early what the adults already know, that the family is balanced on a narrow beam, and that the kindest thing a small person can do is to become light. Some children learn that as fear. The evidence of Caroline's whole later life suggests she learned it as competence, as making herself useful instead of loud. But that is reading backward from the woman to the girl. It stays a suggestion, not a fact. The work, at least, is not a suggestion. Joseph and Henry Odin stepped into chores that had been their father's. The ploughing, the hauling, the axe work. Boys of 11 and 10 doing a man's labour at an age when their arms had not yet grown into the sentence they were serving. Martha, Jane and Caroline moved up the ladder behind them, into the endless female economy of the house. The spinning, the mending, the churning, the minding of Eliza and the baby. You have heard the phrase, children had to grow up fast back then. Inside it, when you slow it down, is something more particular. Childhood did not disappear. It was traded chore by chore for the families staying alive, and everyone could see the trade happening, including the children making it. The seasons themselves refused to acknowledge that anything had changed. Sap still rose in the maples at the end of that first winter, and somebody still had to haul and boil it. The wet fields still wanted ploughing in the spring of 1846. The garden still wanted planting, hoeing, watching. The hens went on laying wherever hens lay, and the whole green machinery of the year ground forward exactly as if the household, running alongside it, were whole. There is something almost insolent about the seasons in a grieving year. They will not pause, and so the people cannot either, and maybe, for children, that was half a mercy. The year kept assigning them things to do. It was the winters that did the counting. Summer, whatever its work, fed the people doing it, green things coming on in their turn, milk at its best, daylight long enough to earn something in. Winter spent what summer had saved, day by day, out of the cellar and the crock and the woodpile, and in a house missing its provider, everyone old enough to count could watch the stores go down and do the quiet division. How many weeks in the barrel? How far to march? A child cannot fix that arithmetic, but a child can absorb it. Standing in the cold pantry, hearing the scrape of the scoop against the bottom of the bin come earlier in the winter than it used to. 2 winters like that came and went between the wreck and the road west. They are the truest part of what the title of tonight's story calls hungry. 2 years passed that way, 1846, 1847. The record of those seasons is thin, a few family recollections and nothing else, and where the record is thin, this story will stay thin with it rather than fill the gap with invented winters. But the thinness itself tells you something worth having. Nobody writes much in years that are all struggle and no change. Diaries fill up when life turns. These pages stayed empty because every day was the same day, work and want and weather, repeated until the seasons blurred into one another. And somewhere inside that sameness, Charlotte was measuring a hard truth. The Brookfield farm, whatever its exact accounts looked like, was a machine built for a family with a man in it. She had bridged 2 years on children's labour and neighbours' kindness and her own endurance, and a bridge is not a road. The country around Brookfield was filling and rising, and land near the city carried prices to match, which is fine news for the people who own plenty of it, and hard news for a widow holding on by her fingers. Farther west, out past the settled townships, there was still new country, government country, where a family with almost nothing might get onto ground of its own for almost nothing. Whatever the ledger of those seasons truly held, no copy of it survives. What survives is what Charlotte did at the end of them, and what she did tells you what she had concluded. She decided to leave. West of Brookfield, out in Jefferson County, there was newer, cheaper country around a settlement called Concord. Why Concord in particular? No letter survives to say. Perhaps word had come through relatives or former neighbours, the way word usually travelled. Perhaps it was simply the nearest open country where the arithmetic worked. You can build the case either way from a rocking chair, and the record will not help you choose. What is certain is that by 1847 the decision had been made, and the Brookfield chapter of the Quiner family was closing. Sit with what leaving meant for this particular family, because it cost them something it would not cost you or me. Other families who buried a father could stand at a graveside and say goodbye before the wagon rolled. The Quiners had no grave. The only marker Henry had was the lake itself, and the lake could not be visited, only lived near, and now they would not even live near it. Moving west meant putting even the water that held him at their backs, and a farm does not fit in a wagon. That is the other cost of every such move, the one the frontier understood so well it rarely bothered to mourn it. The cleared fields stayed, the fences stayed, the cabin with its worn door-sill stayed, and the ground Henry had broken with his own hands would grow someone else's wheat from now on. A family in a wagon carries tools, bedding, seed, kettles, children, and almost nothing else. Everything else a farm is, which is to say years of a particular man's labour standing visible on the land, has to be walked away from at a wagon's pace, looking back as long as you care to look. There is no record that anyone said this aloud. Families mostly don't. It sits under the floorboards of a decision like this one, unspoken, while the practical world rolls forward on top of it, crates and quilts and seed and skillets, 6 children counted and recounted, the stock sorted into what could walk west and what had to be sold or traded away. Joseph was 13 that year, or close to it, and doing a man's day. Thomas, the baby the news had once left in the cradle, was walking and talking. Caroline was 7. 2 of those 7 years by then had happened after the lake. On the last night the kitchen lamp burned in a house already half-packed, the same small flame that had been lit every evening since the November the news came, now throwing its light on bare walls. Whatever Brookfield had been to the Quiners, the home with the father in it was staying behind for good, and the road west began in the dark of an ordinary morning, the way roads did. The lamp went out, the door was pulled to, and that was the last of the Quiner winters in Brookfield. The road west did not announce itself the way the day of leaving had. It was only a road, sandy in places, cut through oak openings and glacial hills that rolled the way water does when you slow down and really look at it. Past the edge of Milwaukee County, it became country that had never heard of the Quiners at all. Nobody along that road knew a family riding past had lost its man to the lake 2 winters before. Nobody looked at this particular wagon and felt sorry for it. For 6 young children who had spent 2 winters being the family the neighbours quietly pitied, that plain unfamiliarity may have been its own kind of mercy. No letter or diary says so in words. The distance was not enormous, not by the frontier's own measure, but a wagon carrying 6 children, and whatever the family had managed to keep from Brookfield did not move quickly. Every mile of it asked something of the one adult driving the whole arrangement forward. There was no hired man for the reins. There was no husband walking alongside to spell her when her arms tired. There was Charlotte, and there were her own children, old enough in places to help and too young in others to do much beyond riding and waiting. The next stop, the next camp, the next morning of the same slow westward push. Concord in Jefferson County was the kind of country a family in this position could still reach. It was newer. It was cheaper. In the last winter, Wisconsin would spend as a territory rather than a state. It was still, on paper, land belonging to no one but the government of the United States. That one dry fact is the whole reason this room exists. Nothing more complicated than that. Statehood arrived that May. It meant a great deal to lawmakers in a new capital. It meant almost nothing to a widow already living on the ground in question. She wanted from her government one thing only, a clear and lasting claim to 40 acres she could call hers before another winter came around. Sometime after the family had settled onto that ground and put in whatever first crop the season allowed, Charlotte Quiner walked into a land office, one ordinary morning. She meant to make something permanent out of what had, until then, only been a place to be. A land office in this period was not a grand building. It was a room with a ledger and a clerk who had seen every kind of buyer the frontier produced. A strongbox held the papers that turned a family's presence on a piece of ground into a fact the government would honour. Other settlers came and went through that same door most weeks, mostly men, mostly with a wife waiting at home to hear how the transaction had gone. Into that room, on her own errand, walked a widow with 6 children. By most tellings of this period's property law, she carried more legal standing to do what she was about to do than she had held 3 years earlier, back when she still had a husband. The law of that era had a name for families who did exactly what the Quiners appear to have done, arriving on government land ahead of any formal sale, putting in a crop before the paperwork caught up to them. Congress called it preemption. It existed for precisely this reason, to let an ordinary family stake real improvements onto land before anyone with deeper pockets could bid the price of it out of their reach at a crowded public sale. A family who settled a claim this way earned the right, later, to buy it at the government's own standing price, rather than whatever a competitive auction might have driven it up to. Whether the Quiners ever used that particular word for their own situation, no letter says. But a family in exactly their position, present on the ground a full year before the receipt was written, was exactly the kind of family that law was built to protect. Women who held land in their own name on this frontier, in this decade, were not common. Most acreage sold by the government in these years was bought by men, or by households where a husband's name did the buying, even when a wife's labour stood behind every bit of it. A widow's purchase, resting entirely on her own signature and nobody else's, was unusual enough that a clerk in that office would have processed only a handful of transactions like it in a given year. Exactly how few, no surviving count will tell you with any precision. That is worth sitting with. It runs against the grain of what people usually assume about a woman alone on the frontier. Students of this era's property law will tell you a wife's name on a document of this kind generally needed her husband's beside it. Some transactions needed his consent before her name could appear at all. A widow's name needed no one's. Losing Henry had cost this family nearly everything a household can be asked to give up. It had not, strangely, cost Charlotte her own legal voice. If anything, in this one narrow respect, it had handed that voice back to her, whole and unshared, the way it had not been hers alone since before her wedding day to a young man named Henry Quiner, more than a decade before. What she bought on the 7th of February 1848 was 40 acres. What she paid was $50. The government standing price for land of this kind in this era ran to $1.25 an acre. 40 acres at that price comes to exactly $50, the same figure written on Charlotte's receipt. One more small proof that this was exactly what it appears to have been. An ordinary government land sale, and nothing more elaborate than that. Both figures survive because the paper survives, though not, as it happens, the first copy of it. The document that has come down to us is a duplicate. It was filed again years afterward, in 1866, once the original had gone missing or worn past reading, the way papers did in a house with 6 children in it. A duplicate still carries the same 40 acres and the same $50 the first copy would have carried. It still carries the same name at the bottom, written once and copied faithfully the second time, long after the winter it was first signed had passed into family memory. Charlotte Quiner, not wife of, not widow of, though everyone standing in that office would have known exactly what she was. Just her own name, doing on that page the same plain work any buyer's name does on a land receipt anywhere, proving that this ground now answered to her and to no one else. Picture the room around that signature if you want to. A clerk sliding the paper across a plank counter worn smooth by other hands. A pen that had already signed a dozen names that week and would sign a dozen more before Friday. A line of other business stood behind her. Men in from their own claims, their own $50 folded into a coat pocket. None of them, so far as anyone recorded, thought twice about the widow ahead of them in line. Outside, February, the last February this territory would spend without a star of its own on any flag. Inside, a woman who had crossed a lake's worth of grief and 2 winters of counting down to this single ordinary transaction. She put her own name on 40 acres of frozen Wisconsin ground because the United States government would sell it to her. No law standing in that winter said it could not. No account describes the walk out of that office, or the road home after it. What it can do is weigh the $50, because the family arithmetic behind that one figure is its own quiet scene. $50 in the money of that decade was not a sum a widowed household assembled by accident. It was months of managed scarcity made visible in a single payment. Every mended garment that was mended once more instead of replaced. Every barrel bought smaller than the winter wanted. Every season the household fed itself thin and set the difference aside. Nobody wrote down how long that particular $50 took to gather, or what was gone without along the way, and the honest assumption is the plain one that it took as long as such sums took careful families in hard circumstances, and cost the daily comfort such sums always cost. What makes the figure worth holding a moment longer is what it was for. Not seed, not stock, not a roof repair. The ordinary places a scarce dollar went on this frontier. Ground. Permanent, deeded, weatherproof ground. The one purchase that could not shrink, spoil, or burn. A woman who had seen a lake swallow her household's whole future in one November evening chose, with the first real money her family gathered afterward, the single thing on the frontier's shelf that no storm could take back. The record does not call that a philosophy. It only shows you the receipt. But a receipt can carry a philosophy when you know what stood behind it, and this one carried hers. Whether any of her own children stood inside that office to watch her sign it, no account says. What the children knew instead was simpler. It was the thing every child in a house like that one learns without needing to see the paperwork, which is when a house has started sitting differently underneath them than it used to. 40 acres was not a large farm. It was a beginning, not an estate, and nobody in that office that morning would have called it a triumph. But it was the families again, entirely, held by the one adult left standing in it. That is a different thing from the Brookfield years, when everything the family used had belonged, in the end, to a claim a dead man once made, and a widow had only been permitted to keep working it. Brookfield had been Henry's ground. Charlotte had been allowed to hold on to it. Concord was Charlotte's ground, plainly, and the difference, small as 40 acres sounds, was the difference between standing on borrowed footing and standing on your own. There is a version of this story that treats a morning like this one as a single flash of unlikely fortitude. That would not be the honest reading of it. What that land office morning actually shows is not a sudden burst of courage out of nowhere. It shows the same undemonstrative discipline that had already carried this family through 2 Brookfield winters, now applied to a legal document instead of a woodpile or a garden row. Whatever steadiness this family would need for the years still ahead of it is already visible here, in full, in a widow standing at a plank counter with $50 and her own signature. The arriving and the owning were 2 separate moments, and this story means to keep them that way rather than let them blur into one telling. The family had likely reached this ground sometime in 1847, ahead of any paper that made the arrangement official. Frontier families often lived on land this way, well before the government's slower machinery caught up and let them buy it outright. The purchase itself waited for the following February. A family can work ground for a season before it can own it, and this family did exactly that. Living on borrowed time, in the plainer sense, using land they did not yet legally hold, until the day the paperwork at last caught up with where they already were. What that first year on unowned ground actually looked like for 6 children and one worn-out mother, no detailed account preserves. There would have been a cabin to raise, or a borrowed one to make do in until their own stood. There would have been ground to break that had never felt a plough, oak roots to grub out by hand, a garden to start fresh in soil nobody in the family had tested before, fences to set where no fences had stood, a well to dig, or a spring to find and trust. Joseph and Henry Odin, old enough by then to do a hired man's share of it, whether anyone called it that or not, would have carried the heaviest part. The younger children carried what children in a year like that always carry, everything smaller, unglamorous, and constant. The fetching and the minding and the small chores that keep a household running while the bigger work goes on around them. Where the paper falls silent, this story falls silent with it, rather than filling the gap with invented labour. What to survive, plainly, in a government hand is how that year ended. 40 acres, $50. Her own name. Think for a moment about what a signature like that actually settles, beyond the acreage itself. It settles a question the Brookfield years had left open the whole time, whether a woman who had lost everything a household usually needs from a husband could still build something that belonged to her outright, not as caretaker of somebody else's claim, but as its owner. The answer, in February of 1848, was written in ink, and it is still legible today. She could. She did. It would not be the last time this particular story turned on a woman's own name at the bottom of a page. That next page was still years away. This one belonged, for now, entirely to Charlotte. 6 children grew up watching their mother do this exact thing more than once in the years still ahead, quietly setting her own name to whatever the moment required, trusting the paper to hold up her end of it. A daughter raised inside that pattern learned something no lecture could teach her nearly as well. This story will have reason to watch that particular lesson resurface years from now in a very different kind of contract. That answer did not erase the 2 winters that came before it. Nothing in this story claims one signed paper undid a father's drowning, or 2 years of watching a cellar empty faster than a calendar filled. What changed was the ground the family now stood on, in every sense that phrase allows. Not borrowed, not a dead man's claim being kept warm for him. Hers. The spring that followed brought the family's first planting season on ground that was this time entirely their own. Whatever the yield turned out to be, it was the first harvest in 3 years that belonged, from seed to table, to nobody's claim but Charlotte's. Neighbours riding past would have seen a widow's household working 40 acres the way every other household on that stretch of Concord Township worked its own, ploughing when the ground allowed it, planting what the season called for, watching the sky the way every farm family on that frontier watched it. There would have been little in the daily look of the place to mark it as different from the farm beside it. The difference, the whole difference, was underneath, in a paper folded away by the kitchen lamp, and no neighbour could have seen it simply by looking at the fields. You would have needed to walk inside the cabin itself, past the lamp to the shelf where that paper was kept, to find any real sign of what had actually changed. The paper was real. That alone was enough. That evening, or one very like it, the family's own kitchen lamp burned again in a house that finally sat on paper the family owned outright. It was the same kind of light that had gone dark in Brookfield on the last night there. The same small, ordinary flame this story has carried from room to room. It fell that night, across a receipt folded away somewhere safe. 40 acres and $50 in Charlotte's own name, proof of something plain. The woman who had walked out of Brookfield a widow with nothing but children and endurance had walked into a Jefferson County land office. She walked back out of it holding something on paper that was fully, legally, undeniably her own. Stay a moment by that lamp and the paper Charlotte signed. Nights like this one live in a little book, Evenings on the Prairie, at prairiesecrets.com. Point your phone at the QR code waiting on the screen, or find the links in the description and pinned comments. No rush tonight. Wide awake or nearly asleep, you are welcome here, and I'm glad of your company. Now, back to the winter. Back to the winter then, because the ground was theirs now. But 40 acres does not work itself, and one determined widow, however capable she had proven herself in a land office, was still one adult standing where a household usually stood 2. That plain fact, more than any romantic account of courtship, is the honest place to begin the years that followed. 1 adult, then, eventually, 2. Sometime in the year or so after that signature, a neighbouring farmer named Frederick Marshall Holbrook began appearing at that same table more than once. A stranger at first. He farmed nearby, in the same corner of Jefferson County the family now called home. A man near 40, born in 1809. By every account of his own life up to that point, he had never yet married. How long he had already been farming that stretch of Jefferson County before the wedding, no source specifies. Only that he was established enough in the neighbourhood that his marriage to Charlotte would have surprised no one nearby, whatever it may have felt like from inside the house itself. What exactly he brought to that table beyond himself, no single source will settle for you. This story is not going to pretend otherwise. because two respectable accounts disagree flatly on the one detail you would most want to know. One says Frederick came to the marriage a bachelor, plainly, with no children of his own at all. Another says he came to it a widower, already raising 6 of his own. Both cannot be true. There is no honest way to choose between them from this distance that would not amount to guessing out loud and calling it history. It matters more than it might sound like it should, because the two versions describe two very different households, one where 6 Quiner children became the only children at that table, one where 12 children of 2 families were suddenly expected to share it. The two accounts rest on different kinds of evidence, one drawn from a family's own compiled record, the other from a locally kept household listing, and neither has yet produced anything strong enough to overrule the other. Until one does, this story will keep telling you both versions honestly, the way any responsible account of a disputed record ought to, rather than quietly picking whichever version makes for a smoother scene. What can be said plainly, regardless of which version you lean toward, is only this. On the 2nd day of June, 1849 in Jefferson County, Charlotte Quiner became Charlotte Holbrook. However many children Frederick may or may not have brought into that marriage with him, her 6 came too, every one of them, into a house that, from that day forward, held a stranger at the head of its table. A second marriage for a widow already raising 6 children was not, by the ordinary custom of that country and that decade, a large occasion. The people who have looked closely at this period's rural weddings will tell you they tended to be modest, practical affairs, held close to home, witnessed by a handful of neighbours and family rather than staged as anything grand. There is no reason to imagine Charlotte and Frederick's day looked any different. Small, most likely. Practical, almost certainly. What made it worth remembering was not its size. It was what it quietly rearranged inside a household that had spent 4 years answering to no man at all. Blended households of this particular kind were not unusual on the Wisconsin frontier of this decade. Death struck often enough, and young enough, that second marriages folding one set of children in alongside another, or in alongside none at all, were common enough that neighbours would have thought little of it. What makes this particular blending harder to describe today is not that it was rare in its own time. It is that so little of what actually passed at that table survives in anyone's own words, leaving this story to describe the outline of the change without ever quite describing the feel of it from the inside. There was also, in a marriage like this one, a practical question that mattered on the frontier every bit as much as sentiment did. What became of Charlotte's own 40 acres, now that a husband stood beside her again? The people who study this period's property law will tell you plainly that a woman's remarriage did not simply hand her land over to a new husband's management by default. How any one household actually worked out day-to-day authority over a particular field is another matter. That kind of detail rarely survives in any account, family or otherwise. What can be said plainly is that the 40 acres Charlotte had bought in her own name in 1848 remained on paper exactly what it had always been. Not his, still hers. Hers, regardless of whatever practical arrangements a working farm household made about who walked out to plough which field on a given morning. Frederick's own farm, whatever its exact size, and Charlotte's 40 acres almost certainly ran as a single combined operation from the wedding forward, worked by whichever hands were available on a given morning, regardless of which parcel a particular fence happened to sit on. The deed itself never changed. The name at the bottom stayed hers. The daily labour, sensibly enough, stopped asking. Picture that first shared meal, whatever day it actually fell on. A wedding does not finish a story. It only opens a new room inside it. 6 children who had known exactly one father and had spent 4 years since learning to live without him now sat down to supper across from a man. By any honest accounting, he was still mostly unknown to them. He was not their father. Nobody at that table, least of all the children, would have mistaken the 2 men for one another, and nothing in this story asks you to believe they did. He was plainly a stranger who had become, for reasons of his own the paper does not preserve, and for reasons of Charlotte's the paper does not preserve either, the man whose voice now carried at that table. A table that had gone 4 years without a man's voice carrying at it. Whatever the two adults felt about each other, no letter says. Whatever 6 children felt about a stranger giving orders in a house that had been, for 4 years, run entirely by a widow, and whichever of her own were old enough to be trusted, none of it comes down to us in anyone's own words either. What comes down to us instead is the practical shape of what changed. A second adult's labour now stood between the family and every task that had, until that spring, fallen entirely to Charlotte, and whichever child could be spared from school or chores to help her. Fields one widow and a handful of children had broken by main strength now had a farmer's full attention behind them as well. The cow, the garden, more hands now to tend both. A barn that had been patched together by boys still growing into their own strength could, at last, be built and mended by a grown man who had done the work before. The root cellar, the wood pile, the fences, all the ordinary infrastructure a farm needs to survive a Wisconsin winter, had a second set of hands behind them now, hands that had spent decades learning exactly this kind of labour before they ever sat down at this particular table. Harvest, in particular, is not forgiving work for a household running short on adult strength. A second set of shoulders behind the scythe and the wagon meant grain got in before weather could ruin it. It meant hay got cut, dried and stacked on something closer to a farm's own schedule, rather than whatever schedule exhaustion allowed. None of this made headlines in anyone's letters, because it was never meant to. It was simply what an ordinary, adequately staffed farm household looked like. A thing this particular household had not been able to say of itself in quite some time. If you have ever watched a household slowly steady itself after a hard stretch, you already know it rarely announces itself in one dramatic turn. It arrives instead in a string of ordinary days that simply stop being emergencies, one after another, until enough of them have passed that nobody in the house quite remembers when the emergency stopped. That, more than any single scene this story could stage for you, is the truest account of what these years did for the Quiner and Holbrook children alike. Eased, not solved. This story means to keep the two words apart. Whatever this new household became, it did not undo 4 years of hardship in a single season, and nothing here pretends that it did. What it did was stop the hardship from being the only thing this family had. That alone was worth something to 6 children, who had spent 2 hard winters wondering how thin the next one would turn out to be. Chores that had once fallen wherever a household of children and one mother could manage them, now had a new hand to share the heaviest of them. A farm that had run for 2 years on a widow's stubbornness alone could, bit by bit, begin to run instead on ordinary farm rhythms, planting and mending and harvest. The kind of rhythms that do not make for dramatic reading precisely because they mean things had steadied. A stranger at the table, though, does not stay a stranger forever, even when the paper trail that would tell you exactly how that change happened simply is not there to read. Within the household Frederick had joined, seasons kept doing what seasons do, turning over one into the next regardless of who sat where at supper. Somewhere inside those turning seasons, a genuine family, blended, imperfectly documented, and real all the same, began to take a shape none of the surviving papers describe from the inside. Joseph and Henry Odin, by then nearly grown themselves, likely settled into whatever working arrangement 2 young men and a stepfather manage on a shared farm. Some mixture of deference and independence. No letter bothers to spell it out, because it was, to the people living it, simply how the days went. Martha Jane, Caroline and Eliza Ann grew up inside that same rearranged household, old enough by degrees to take on more of its daily keeping, cooking and mending and minding the youngest among them. Young Thomas grew from the baby the family had once carried out of Brookfield into a boy old enough to be given real chores of his own. For the youngest of the 6, memory of any harder time may barely have survived at all, folded quietly under everything ordinary that came after it. For the oldest, memory very likely ran the other way. Straight back through a set of winters this new steadiness could ease but never fully erase. Not far from that farm stood a district schoolhouse. A schoolhouse, this story means to return to before long. Children in that stretch of Concord Township were sent there whenever the fields could spare them. It is worth walking one lap of that ordinary year, because ordinary was the whole achievement, and it is the one thing a hard luck story never gets to show. Spring on such a farm meant ploughing and planting and mud, boots left at the door, the year's whole gamble going into the ground on faith. Summer meant growth and weeding and the long light, meals carried out to the field on the heavy days. Harvest gathered every hand the household could raise, the one season when nobody, not even the youngest, was entirely spared. And winter, the season that had once meant counting and fear in a Brookfield kitchen, now meant something almost unrecognisable to the older children. It meant school terms whenever the fields allowed. It meant stores laid by that were actually sufficient. It meant evenings when the worst thing in the house was the cold in the corners, and that cold was only weather now, not a question about the spring. No diary hands over a single one of those days, and none of them would have seemed worth a diary to the people living them. That is precisely the measure of how far this family had come. The years worth writing down had been survived. The years not worth writing down had arrived. For a girl Caroline's age growing up inside them, those unrecorded seasons were the longest stretch of steadiness her life had yet contained. And steadiness, arriving after what she could remember arriving before it, does not read as boredom. It reads as wealth. 5 winters passed between that wedding table and the cradle this room is about to describe. No source hands them over in that kind of detail. What can be said is that they were, by every sign available, ordinary winters rather than desperate ones. Nothing more dramatic than that. That, plainly, is why this room exists at all. A household that could still, after everything behind it, welcome a new child safely into the world in the dead of a Wisconsin January was a household that had, in every practical sense, come through. The one new fact this room can state without any hedge at all arrived on the 20th of January 1854. A daughter was born to Frederick and Charlotte, a half-sister to all 6 of Charlotte's children by Henry, and she was given the name Charlotte Elizabeth. The household that would one day know her as Aunt Lottie called her that from the very start. Both sources this story trusts agree completely on her birth, her parents, and her name, with no dispute standing between them anywhere. Not a single one. Whatever remained unsettled about the marriage that produced her, nothing about her own arrival is in question. On that single point every source agrees. What that arrival can tell you plainly is that the household producing it had settled into something lasting rather than temporary. A new baby born 4.5 years into a marriage is not the mark of 2 adults still testing whether an arrangement will hold. It is the mark of a household that had by then simply become what it was going to be, for however long that turned out to be. Whatever any of the 6 children watching from the next room may have privately felt about a new half-sister taking her place at the same table, none of it changed what the household had already become. By the time that new sister was placed in a cradle in a Concord farmhouse, the household around her had plainly stopped merely surviving. It had a second adult's labour in the fields. It had apparently enough steadiness underneath it to bring a baby safely into the world and give her a name that would be spoken with real affection for the rest of that family's long life together. And it had, at its centre, a girl who had watched a lake take her father, back when she was small enough to still be called a child in every sense of the word. By the January her half-sister arrived. She was a girl of 14, old enough now to begin asking what she herself would make of everything these 6 years had built around her, and asked of her in turn. Caroline, in particular among her siblings, had now spent more of her conscious life inside a rebuilding household than inside the one Henry Quiner had originally provided. She had been not quite 6 when the lake took her father, 8 when her mother signed for 40 acres, and 14 when a half-sister arrived to prove that new household had settled into something lasting. Nobody asked her yet, Whatever calm steadiness she would one day be remembered for, this stretch of years is where its materials were gathered, one ordinary season at a time, long before anyone thought to ask her about any of it. That question belonged to Caroline alone. This house was about to answer it in its own particular way, with her own name written on a very different kind of paper than the one her mother had signed in that land office 6 years before. Several rooms back in the story, a district schoolhouse was named and set aside for later. It stood a short walk from the Holbrook land in Concord Township. Later has arrived. On an April morning in 1858, with the last of a Wisconsin winter still holding in the shaded ruts of the road, the young woman walking toward that schoolhouse was 18 years old. For the first time in her life, she was not walking toward it as a pupil. She had sat in that same room herself years before. The same hard benches, the same slates, the same recitations she was now about to hear from the front of the room instead of the back of it. A district in this period sent every child of school age to the one schoolhouse it could afford to keep standing, and Caroline was, by every account this story trusts, a child of that district for most of the years already told here. What she carried away from those pupil years, no letter of her own preserves for us to quote. What can be said is simpler. She had learned enough sitting on those benches as a girl that a superintendent would judge her fit to stand at the front of that same room instead. No pupil beside her this time, no older child to answer to. Just the road, the door, and whatever waited behind it. A schoolhouse in this stretch of Wisconsin, on the first morning of the new teacher's term, would have been the same building it had always been. The same stove, the same benches. What changed was who stood at the door deciding when the morning began. This story cannot tell you what Caroline felt lifting the latch that particular morning, whether her hands shook or her voice caught on the first word she spoke to a room of children only a year or two younger than she was. No one wrote that down. What this story can tell you is only what came after. A term completed, a wage paid, a signature that held. A schoolhouse of this kind rarely asks for much. One room, a stove set near the middle of it, a row of plain benches, a shelf of slates, a water pail with a dipper the whole room shared without much thought given to it either way. It was not a grand setting for the work being asked of the young woman standing in front of it that April, and there is no reason to make it grander than it was. A cold floor in the early morning before the stove caught. The smell of chalk dust and wet wool coats hung by the door. Nothing to dress up. Nothing that needed dressing up. What made the room matter was never the room itself. It was what a teacher was trusted to do inside it. Becoming a country teacher in this part of Wisconsin was not simply a matter of wanting the position. A young woman had first to be examined, in person, by the superintendent charged with judging whether she knew enough arithmetic, enough reading, enough of the plain business of a common school, to be trusted in front of other people's children for a full term. What that examination asked of her, no paper this story has found describes. What the record answers plainly is that she passed it. What survives is the document that only exists on the far side of passing. This step was, at once, ordinary and unusual for a young woman of her age in this decade. Ordinary because district schools across this stretch of Wisconsin leaned on unmarried young women to teach their summer terms, when the youngest children came and the older boys were needed most in the fields. Winter terms, when those same older boys returned to a crowded room, more often went to a man the district judged able to keep order among them. Unusual because the position still asked a young woman to stand alone in front of a room, answerable to a district of grown farmers for every hour a term required of her, with no husband's or father's name standing behind her own on the paper. Whether Caroline taught a summer term or a winter one, no surviving record specifies. Whichever it was, the arrangement was hers alone to answer for. That document is dated the 19th of April, 1858. It names District Number 5. It sets her wage at $10 a month, with board provided by the families whose children she would teach. It carries her own signature at the bottom, in her own hand. This story told you, several rooms back, that a very different kind of paper was coming for Caroline, one bearing her own name and nobody else's. This is that paper. Nobody signed it for her. Nobody signed it with her. It took the same plain courage it had taken her mother to walk into a land office 10 years before. The paper this time belonged to a daughter rather than a mother. The signature at the bottom of it was Caroline's own, answerable to nobody but herself. $10 a month was not a small sum for a young woman to be trusted with entirely on her own account. It was enough to buy cloth for a season's clothing, or to set a little aside toward whatever came next, or simply to hold in her own hand as proof that a district full of grown farmers and their wives had judged her fit to be paid for her mind rather than fed for her labour. Whether Caroline spent it, saved it, or handed some portion of it back to the Holbrook household, no ledger or letter preserved for this story says. What the contract proves, without any of those details filled in, is plainer than that. The wage was hers to decide about in the first place. Nobody else's name stood beside hers on that line, the same way no other name had stood beside Charlotte's on the land receipt 10 winters before. Mother and daughter had each, in their own turn, stood alone in front of an official stranger and walked out with a paper that answered to them and to nobody else. You do not need every detail of a schoolroom to understand what that contract meant to the girl signing it. A district school here was, as a rule, 1 room, 1 stove, and 1 teacher, responsible for every age of child a township could send her, from the smallest ones just learning their letters to boys nearly her own age working through long division in the same crowded room. She would have swept that room herself most mornings before the first pupil arrived, carried in the water, fed the stove through whatever the term demanded of it that season. A teacher's board in this period commonly rotated from household to household, across the district, a week or a month at a stretch, rather than settling her under one roof for the whole term. Which families took her in, and for how long, no source kept for this account spells out. What can be said honestly is enough on its own. $10 a month, and a roof that moved from family to family was, for a young woman in 1858, an income entirely her own, earned by her own labour. $10, 1 month, her own hand on the line. A day inside a schoolroom like this one likely opened with the children filing in by age, the youngest toward the front benches nearest the stove, the oldest toward the back where a growing boy's restlessness caused less trouble. Recitation moved by age group through the morning. 1 row called forward while the rest bent over slates or a shared reader. A midday break let the youngest run off whatever a morning of stillness had stored up in them. The afternoon closed the way the morning opened, in recitation, until the light or the hour told a teacher it was time to send them home to chores. None of this is offered as a record of Caroline's own classroom, which no surviving paper describes down to the day. It is the shape most one-room schools of this period took, because there was rarely reason or means to take any other. There was, beyond the wage itself, a quieter reason. A district like this leaned on young, unmarried women to fill its schoolrooms. A term of teaching was, across this stretch of the frontier, commonly understood as a season many young women passed through, on the way to a household of their own. It was a stretch of years in which a young woman proved out, to herself as much as to any superintendent, that she could keep a room of other people's children in order, that she could keep a fire fed through a hard season, that she could answer for her own conduct and her own wage, without a husband's or a father's name standing behind either one. What a young woman carried out of that kind of proving beyond the $10 a month itself was not written down in any contract. It went with her all the same, into whatever household she built next. A record cannot tell you what she felt walking home that first week. It can only tell you what she was owed, and by whom, and how much. $10. Board. Her own signature. That is the whole of what survives, and this story will not stretch it further than that. Set the scene of those weeks against the scenes this story opened with, and the distance the family had travelled becomes something you can measure without a single number. A dozen years earlier, a girl not yet 6 had stood in a household learning what a lake had done to it. Now that same girl rose on winter-dark mornings, in a settled house, and walked a road she knew by heart to a room that was hers to command. She laid the fire in the schoolhouse stove before the first pupils came stamping in, because a teacher's day began with kindling, not chalk. She heard recitations from benches she had once sat on herself, minded slates she had once written on, and sent other families' children home at dusk to chores she had once hurried home to do. There is a plainness to that circle that no invention could improve. The district did not hire a stranger. It hired a girl it had watched grow up through its own hard winters, and it trusted her with its children, partly because it had seen, over those dozen years, exactly how her family met what came at it. No superintendent wrote that reasoning down, and this story offers it only as the way such districts generally weighed such choices. But the contract itself is not a guess. $10 a month, board included, her name at the bottom. However, the district reasoned its way to that April morning. The paper says plainly where the reasoning ended. Not far off on the Holbrook land, Charlotte's household carried on through these same seasons in the plain, undramatic way a settled household does once the worst of its hardship has passed. This story will not linger there. It has already told you what those years built. It is enough to say that the household Caroline walked out of most mornings toward that schoolhouse was, by 1858, a steady one. That steadiness was itself part of what made room for a daughter to stand her own examination, rather than be needed every daylight hour at home. Think for a moment about the 4 winters standing behind that April morning, the ones this account has not stopped to walk you through one by one. Caroline had been 14 when her half-sister Lottie was born, into a household that had, by then, plainly settled into something lasting. She had grown, across the years since, alongside a half-sister young enough to call her something closer to a second mother than a sister some mornings, and alongside brothers old enough now to do a grown man's share of the farm's work. Her older sister Martha Jane and her younger sister Eliza Ann had gone on growing up beside her through those same ordinary years, the way sisters do, without this story needing to invent a single scene between them to know it happened. She was 18 now, walking to a schoolhouse to be paid for her own knowledge, instead of fed and sheltered for her labour on somebody else's farm. Nothing that survives explains those 4 years scene by scene. No letter says when she first thought of teaching, or who first suggested the district needed her, or what she felt walking into that examination room to be judged by a stranger she'd never had reason to meet before that morning. What the record offers instead is plainer. A girl who had grown up watching her own mother sign for land at a county office had arrived, by 18, at the point of standing for an examination entirely her own. 4 winters, 1 examination, 1 paper. The contrast is not subtle, and this story does not need to make it subtle to be honest. A girl not quite 6 had once stood on a lakeshore while a family lost its only wage earner in a single November storm. A young woman of 18 now stood in a district schoolhouse with her own signature on her own contract, earning her own $10 a month. Between those 2 facts sit years of ordinary labour this story has already told you plainly, without dressing either end of it up past what the surviving paper allows. A dependent child had become, by the strict evidence of 1 document, a woman who earned a wage in her own name, answerable to no household but the one she had built for herself inside that schoolroom. What she did inside that room across the term that followed, no single record catalogues day by day. Recitation, spelling work through aloud, arithmetic on slates, a Bible read as often for its language as for its lessons, long stretches of patient repetition, with children who arrived at wildly different levels of reading, all of them crowded into the same room under the same young teacher. None of that is invented here. It is drawn from what a one-room school in this same stretch of the frontier commonly required of its teacher, offered as ordinary context rather than a claim about Caroline's own particular classroom, which no document preserved for this story spells out in that kind of detail. A teacher in her position would most likely have kept order among children ranging from 6 years old to nearly her own age, taught them all from the same handful of worn readers, banked the stove herself against a cold snap, settled arguments between children not much younger than herself, and answered alone, for whatever went right or wrong inside four walls for an entire term. What this room can say with confidence is smaller than a full accounting of her classroom, and in its way, larger. A girl who had spent the hardest years of her childhood watching her mother hold a family together on stubbornness, and 40 acres had grown into a young woman capable of standing an examination, keeping a fire through a cold season, managing a room full of other people's children, and being paid for all three in her own name. Whatever this story eventually decides made her quiet, this room belongs to the part of her that was instead simply capable, years before anyone thought to wonder what it was costing her. That capability did not vanish once the schoolhouse door closed behind her for the last time. It did not stay behind with the chalk and the readers. It went with her into whatever came next. Whatever waited for her further down that road, she did not arrive there empty-handed. Whether Caroline went on teaching after that term, or any term after it, nothing preserved for this account says. Married women in this period rarely kept a district contract for long, since a household of her own left little room in a young wife's week for someone else's children. What can be said with confidence is only this. Whatever came after that April morning, the wage, the signature, and the standing they proved were hers to keep, whether or not the schoolroom itself stayed part of her life much longer. Two documents now stand behind this story, mothers and daughters 10 years apart, a land receipt in 1848, a teaching contract in 1858, different offices, different officials, different sums of money entirely, the same plain fact underneath both of them. A woman in this family, when the moment asked it of her, could face down an official with no reason to be kind to her and come away with a paper instead of a refusal. This story has not needed to invent a single word of feeling to make that pattern visible. The paper does the work by itself. It always has in this particular family's story, and something else had already been happening nearby, for longer than this room as yet had reason to mention. Not far from the Holbrook land, in that same stretch of Concord Township, another family had been settled since the very end of 1853, 4 full years before Caroline ever walked toward that schoolhouse to be examined. This story now turns to them, because within a few more years their eldest son, and this district school's newest teacher, would become, to one another, considerably more than neighbours. The Ingalls family arrived in Concord Township on the last day of 1853, in the deep cold of a Wisconsin winter. Within 3 short weeks, that same season would bring Charlotte and Frederick's daughter Lottie into the world a short distance away. A wagon arriving at the very end of December, in that part of the country, meant a family willing to finish out a hard trip, rather than wait somewhere easier for the worst of the weather to pass. It was, in that sense, an arrival not unlike the one this story described in its very first room. A household staking its future on land it had not yet had time to prove out, in a season that gave it no gentle welcome. Among the household that made that winter arrival was a son named Charles, still a boy by most reckonings of the word, though not for very much longer. One child among a father's and mother's several, settling onto Concord Township land the way whole families across this stretch of Wisconsin kept doing throughout this decade, looking for better ground, or simply more of it, than the place they had left behind. No letter or diary from either household preserves a first impression of the other. One thing is plain enough. The two families were not when Charles and Caroline eventually did take real notice of one another, complete strangers meeting by pure chance. A Quiner cousin had already married into the Ingalls family some years before Charles and Caroline's own courtship began. That is one honest reason 2 households in the same township already knew each other's names well before this room's central pair ever exchanged more than a greeting across a churchyard. Nothing more elaborate than that connects them. This story names that connection once, plainly, and moves on. It owes you no more than that one plain sentence. It will not circle back to explain it again. The household that made that December crossing was, Like the Quiner household, this story opened with larger than one son. A father and a mother had brought several children west with them. Charles among the sons, each one old enough or soon old enough to take up a hand's share of the work a new farm demanded. Which of those brothers and sisters Caroline came to know well, and which she barely knew at all beyond a name at church, no source this story trusts sorts out. A household this size, freshly arrived, likely took a season or two just to become familiar faces rather than new ones. Only one of them matters to the paper this room is building toward. That is Peter, the brother who would one day stand at his own brother's wedding as a witness. Concord Township itself was by the end of that decade no longer the raw ground it had been when either family first arrived on it. 10 years is a long time for a stretch of frontier to sit still, and this stretch did not. More families, more cleared fields, a schoolhouse, a church, roads worn deep enough by regular use that a wagon no longer had to feel its way. A decade of ordinary work by ordinary neighbours had done that. None of that growth belonged to any one household. It belonged to the whole stretch of neighbours who had spent a decade turning empty land into a place with a name, a district number, and a superintendent willing to examine a young woman for a teaching post. Caroline and Charles came of age inside that same slow, ordinary growth, not apart from it. A farm in this stretch of Wisconsin in the 1850s meant, most commonly, wheat. It was the crop that had drawn so many families to this part of the state in the first place, and one that would, within another decade or two, wear out enough of this same ground to send a good many of those families further west again. Whether the Ingalls farm or the Holbrook farm leaned on wheat more heavily than any other crop, no surviving account breaks that down field by field. As ordinary regional context, this much can be said. A young farmer coming of age on Concord Township land in this decade was coming of age inside an economy built largely on that one grain. Its planting in spring, its harvest in late summer, its price deciding a great deal of what a household could or could not afford in the year that followed. Neighbours watched the same sky for the same reasons every August. A township this size did not leave much room for two families to remain unknown to one another for long. Not for a season, and certainly not for 6 years. Weddings, funerals, barn raisings, all of it passed through the same small circle of names a district this size could not help but share. Church on a Sunday. The same district schoolhouse this room has already described. Harvest labour traded back and forth between neighbouring farms when one household's grain came ready before another's. A barn raising or a husking bee that pulled in every family within an easy wagon ride. A young man and a young woman in a township this size met one another, more often than not, at exactly these ordinary gatherings rather than anywhere more private. A churchyard after service, a barn floor cleared for dancing once the raising itself was finished. A sleigh ride arranged among a whole group of young people rather than just two. Whole seasons passed that way. Charles growing from the boy who arrived in that December wagon into a young man doing a full hand's worth of farm work for his own family. Caroline growing from a girl of 14 minding a new half-sister into the young woman who would, before long, stand her own examination at that same schoolhouse. Somewhere across those ordinary years of shared pews and shared harvests, an unmarried farmer's son near Caroline's own age, and a young schoolteacher earning her own wage a few farms over became to one another something more particular than neighbours. A greeting, then another, a shared pew, a name that started coming up more often than the others. What passed between them in courtship, no record this story trusts preserves in either of their own words. It is a gap this story means to leave standing honestly, the way it has left every other unrecorded feeling standing honestly since its very first room. Courtship in a township like this one rarely happened in private, and this story has no reason to pretend otherwise. Farms in this period sat far enough apart that a young man calling on a young woman alone, more than once or twice, would have been noticed by an entire neighbourhood built on exactly that kind of noticing. What courting there was between Charles and Caroline more likely unfolded the way this account has already described the two families meeting in the first place, inside the ordinary gatherings a farm township already provided on its own. None of that tells you what either one of them felt. It tells you only the shape courtship in this particular time and place was built to take, whatever feeling moved inside that shape for these two people in particular. What the record does preserve, plainly and without dispute, is the outcome. On the 1st of February 1860, Caroline Quiner and Charles Ingalls were married. Whoever was called to say the words over them that morning, no record kept for this story names. The wedding stood witnessed by two people this story has already introduced to you separately, though neither of them knew, when this story first named them, that they would one day stand together at the same small ceremony. Peter Ingalls, Charles's own brother, stood as one witness. Martha Jane Quiner, Caroline's own sister, the same sister who had grown up beside her through every winter this story has already described, stood as the other. Two families' worth of witnesses standing behind one small ceremony. Not because either family insisted on it, but because a township this size rarely produced a wedding without at least one name from each side already known to the other. This story has by now asked you to trust a good many papers on its behalf. A newspaper clipping naming a drowned man, a land receipt naming a widow, a teaching contract naming a daughter. It asks you here to trust one more, a marriage witnessed by two people whose own names this account had already given you separately, in separate rooms, long before either of them had reason to share that particular morning. That kind of quiet corroboration, one document's names turning up again inside another document, is exactly the sort of evidence this story has leaned on from its very first room. It is no less trustworthy here for being ordinary. A wedding recorded, witnessed by people already known to this account, is one more entry in the same plain paper trail that has carried Caroline's whole story forward from a lakeshore to this particular morning. This story cannot show you her face that morning. No photograph from that day survives, and no one wrote down what she looked like standing there. It can only show you what she signed, who stood beside her, and what the county clerk recorded afterward. That is not nothing. For a woman this story has spent 6 rooms now trying honestly to know. It is, in fact, most of what there is. Picture, if you will, what that morning likely held, without this story pretending to know more of it than the plain facts allow. A small gathering rather than a grand one, most likely, in a Wisconsin February that would have made anything larger a hardship on the guests alone. Frozen roads, breath showing in the cold between one farmhouse and the next, a dress most likely sewn at home rather than bought, in whatever cloth a household like this one could spare, a minister's words, a signature or a mark in a county register, a shared meal afterward in whichever farmhouse had room enough for both families at once, none of it grand, all of it, in its own quiet way, enough. Cold hands, warm bread most likely, however plain, a house too small for the whole township, and not needing to be any bigger, a fire built up higher than usual for the occasion, and still not quite enough against a Wisconsin February. Two families already familiar with each other's faces from years of the same church and the same fields, brought together now by a match neither family had needed to arrange out of strangers. A bride of 20 years old, who had been not quite 6 when a lake took her father, who had watched her mother sign for 40 acres at 8, who had signed a contract entirely her own at 18, stood now to make a promise that belonged only to her. One that would carry her into a household of her own making, rather than back to any household that had raised her. A bride of 20 was neither unusually young nor unusually old for this part of the country in this decade. Some young women in this kind of farm township married at 16 or 17. Others waited past 25. Caroline's age at marriage sat squarely inside the ordinary range this story's own audience, familiar as it is with this family's later history, would expect. Nothing about the timing of this wedding needs defending. It happened when it happened, for reasons this story has already shown you plainly across 2 full rooms. A wedding for a young woman in this period was rarely only a matter of the heart, whatever the heart was doing underneath it. It was also the one clean, documented hinge between the household a woman was born into and the household she would spend the rest of her life keeping. Until this particular morning, Caroline had been a daughter counted among Charlotte's 6, and later among Frederick's blended household of more than 6. From this morning forward, the record would count her differently, as the wife of a young farmer named Charles Ingalls, head of a household that had not existed the day before. What she carried across that hinge, this story has now spent 2 full rooms showing you plainly, in documents, rather than in guesswork. No diary, no letter home describing the day, only a county register, a signature, 2 witnesses' names, and a date. That is the whole of the paper trail this particular morning left behind. A wage earned in her own name, a mother's example of facing an official alone and coming away with a paper nobody else's name touched. Whatever this story still owes you about where her quiet came from, it owes you that answer built on exactly this kind of evidence, not on any invented feeling this account has no right to claim for her. A farm of his own, still young, still proving itself, waited for her past that morning. What she made of it, and what it made of her, belongs to what this story tells you next, not to this room. Somewhere behind that morning, distant now and mostly quiet, lay a shoreline in Wisconsin, where a storm had once taken a father. These 2 families gave no sign of speaking of at that ceremony. This story does not pull the lake fully back into view here. Not yet. That belongs to what comes after this room. Room enough remains in this account for one more return to that shoreline, and only one. It only lets the lake sit far off, the way an old grief sits at the edge of a wedding morning without anyone at the table needing to name it out loud. 2 rooms, 1 wage, 1 wedding. That is the whole shape of what this part of the story had to give you. Nothing invented, nothing dressed up past what the paper allows. What this room can say, honestly and without needing to say more, is plain enough on its own. A girl who began this story on a shoreline watching had reached, by the 1st of February 1860, a morning entirely of her own making. She had buried nothing of what came before that morning. She had simply carried it, quietly, into whatever came next, the way this account has watched her carry every hard season that came before it, one ordinary season at a time, though nobody stopped at the time to ask her what any of it had cost. Whatever this story still has left to tell you about what those years built inside her, it has now reached the last morning this account is permitted to enter before the life that followed became one this story does not tell. That much, at least, this account can promise you honestly before it lets her go. A wedding morning ends, the way every morning does, in an afternoon nobody troubles to write down. Whatever came after that morning in Concord Township belongs to a household this account has already promised not to enter. What belongs here is smaller than a household, and older than a single day. It is the shape of the years you have already been given, gathered up once more from a little further back than any one room could stand. Say the whole of it once, plainly, because a story owes its listener that much before it lets a subject go. A girl, not yet 6, lost her father to a lake in November of 1845. A mother carried 6 children through 2 hungry years on a farm built for a man who was no longer in it. That same mother walked into a county land office in the winter of 1848 and bought 40 acres under a signature that answered to nobody but her. A stepfather joined the table the year after that, a household eased rather than solved. A daughter grew up inside all of it, and at 18 walked into a schoolhouse to be examined for a wage that belonged to nobody but her either. At 20, she married a young farmer from a family that had been living a few fields away for 6 years, before either of them had reason to notice the other. That is the whole shape, told in one breath. Because you earned every piece of it already, across 6 rooms, and this story owes you no second telling of any single one of them. Tonight opened with a question. Whether the calm this family's most famous daughter would one day be loved for was something Caroline was born already carrying, or something these years built into her one winter at a time. By now the honest answer looks less like a guess and more like a sum already worked. Nobody is born knowing how to carry a household's grief without letting it show on her face at the breakfast table. Nobody is born already practiced at usefulness rather than noise, at facing an official stranger with the same plain nerve her mother had shown years earlier, at setting her own name to a wage contract with a hand steady enough that nobody at that examination had cause to doubt her. Those are not qualities a person is handed at birth. They are qualities a family builds the slow way, out of ordinary hardship met on ordinary mornings, by people who never once sat down and decided they were building anything at all. Watch how evenly that sum divides across the two women. The mother was not born knowing how to do any of it either. Charlotte Quiner learned it the way her daughter would learn it after her, with less warning and higher stakes, in the space of a single November. Whatever the family passed down afterward, it did not pass it down as advice. Nobody in that household seems to have said much of anything about any of it. It passed the way such things actually pass, by a child watching, year after year, how a grown woman behaves when the worst has already happened and the work still needs doing before dark. The title of tonight made one promise it is not yet settled in full, and it should be settled here, plainly, before the lamp goes low. 6 hungry years. By the reckoning this story laid out in its early rooms, they ran from that November on the lake to the seasons when a stepfather's steady wage and a mother's own acres finally put a floor under the table. And if the count is 6 rather than 5 or 7, it is 6 the way a family measures such things, by winters endured rather than by the pages of any calendar. What hunger meant inside those years, one clause is enough to stand for all of it now. Seasons the household fed itself, by careful management more than by plenty. The point of the number was never the number. The point is that the years were countable, and the family counted them one at a time, and came out the far side with every remaining child alive and a mother who had signed for land in her own name in the middle of them. Hungry years happen to many families. Countable, survivable years, answered on paper in a widow's handwriting, are rarer. So take the inventory this room was built to take, because it is short, and every item on it is heavy. From the first winter, Caroline carried the knowledge that a life can change completely between a morning and an evening, and that the people left standing afterward still have to make supper. From the hungry seasons, she carried the habit of usefulness, learned at an age when most children are still learning to be minded. From a certain office door in the winter of 1848, she carried the sight of her mother standing in front of a stranger who held the family's whole next chapter in his inkwell, and walking out again with the paper in her hand. From a schoolhouse a decade on, she carried the weight of her own signature, set down for her own wage, with nobody's name behind hers to steady it. None of it was ever called training. Nobody in Brookfield or Concord sat that girl down and told her she was being prepared for anything. It was simply what the years in this family asked, and she was the daughter who answered by watching closely and saying little. And the watching and the little saying hardened slowly into the very quality the whole world would one day read on her face and misname as mildness. The quiet was never mildness. It was competence that had stopped expecting applause. It was grief folded so early and so well that the folding itself became invisible. It was the settled economy of a person who had learned before the age of 6 that words spent on what cannot be helped are words wasted, and who had 6 long years afterward to practice the arithmetic. Note too what the inventory does not contain, because the absence is as built as the rest. Nothing in any surviving account of Caroline, young or old, reads as bitterness. Nothing reads as fear of the world that had taken so much from her family so early. Whatever those winters put into her, they do not appear to have put in the one thing hardship most reliably leaves behind, and that absence is its own kind of evidence about the household she grew up in. Children learn what loss means by watching what the grown people nearest them do with it. The grown person nearest Caroline answered loss with a wagon, a signature, and a planted field, and grief in that house, however deep it ran, was never so far as any record shows, allowed to become the family's occupation. It was carried, not served. A child raised on that arrangement learns a particular lesson about what feelings are for, that they are real and they are private and they are not an excuse. And whoever Caroline became at her own hearth years later, every surviving description of her sits comfortably inside that lesson. What this account can actually prove of that building, it can prove only on paper. A land receipt with one woman's name standing on it, no husband's name behind hers. A teaching contract with another woman's name standing on it. 10 years and 1 generation later, no mother's name behind hers either. Between those two documents sits the whole argument this story has been making quietly since its very first room. Whatever else this family kept to itself, and most of it stayed kept, those two pieces of paper survived to say plainly what neither woman apparently felt any need to say aloud at the time. That a woman in this particular family asked by hard circumstance to stand alone in front of a stranger holding authority over her could do it twice, 1 generation apart, and walk away each time with a paper instead of a refusal. What this story cannot prove, and has no business pretending to, is what either woman felt doing it. Whether Charlotte's hand held steady walking into that land office, with 6 children's winters riding on one signature. Whether Caroline lay awake the night before her own examination, running sums and readings over in the dark until the lamp burned low. No diary answers either question for us. No letter was kept that says, "This story told you, back in its first room, that the paper survives, and the feeling underneath it mostly does not, and there is no reason to pretend otherwise now, simply because an ending would prefer tidier material than a beginning had to offer it." That, in its own quiet way, is the whole lesson this family's paper trail has to give you. Some of what makes a person is provable at all only because somebody, somewhere, troubled to keep the paperwork. The rest, the private cost underneath every one of those ordinary mornings, is simply gone, the way most of anyone's private cost is gone within 2 generations of a person thinking to ask about it. This account has tried, across 7 rooms now, to be honest about exactly where that line sits. What survives, it has told you plainly, document by document. What does not survive, it has left standing honestly empty, rather than fill with a guest dressed up as memory. There is more road ahead of the young woman who stood at that wedding than this story has any right to walk beside her. Years it will not enter, a household it will not describe. Only one signpost belongs to tonight, and it can be read from here without taking a single step past that February morning. The girl this story has called Caroline would, in rooms far from these and years from now, come to be known by a smaller name. A 3-letter name, spoken first by daughters, and then, through a set of books written long afterward, by more strangers than any woman of Concord Township could have imagined. Ma. The world that met her under that name met the finished quiet and took it for a birthright. Something she simply was, the way a lake is deep. You have sat with the actual ledger of it tonight, and you know what the world did not. The calm was assembled, item by item, winter by winter, signature by signature, in rooms the famous books never entered, by a family that would not have understood what there was to admire. This story makes no claim on the books, or on the marriage, or on anything past the morning it has already left behind. It ends where its own 3 documents end, at a wedding morning in February of 1860, and it means to keep that promise honestly, rather than walk 1 page further than its evidence can carry a lantern. One thing more, and it is for you rather than for her. You've known somebody with a quiet like this. Most families keep one, the person whose calm everybody leans on, and whose price nobody thinks to ask. If tonight has done its work at all, then the next time you sit across a table from that person, some small part of you may wonder, gently and without saying so, what winters went into the folding. That is the only lesson this story will presume to send home with you, and having set it down, it lets the matter rest. What tonight has actually given you then was never meant to be a whole life. It was a girl on a lake shore, a mother at a land office, a daughter at a schoolhouse desk, a bride on an ordinary February morning. 4 documented mornings standing in for 6 hard years and more, close enough together, laid side by side that you can see plainly what got built in the space between them. Whatever calm she carried into everything that came after this particular morning, this account has shown you honestly where it came from. Not something she was born already holding, something a family built around her, out of loss and paper and one steady signature at a time, by people who never stopped to name what they were doing while they went on doing it. That is the last thing this account can tell you about Caroline Quiner before it lets her go. What remains now is only the leaving itself. Picture the lake once more, and only once. Not the newspaper notice this time, not the arithmetic of a widow's winters, just the water itself, the long grey reach of Lake Michigan, the same water that once took a father clean out of a family's reach and gave nothing back to bury. A girl not yet 6 stood somewhere near that shore once, in a world that had a father in it that morning and did not have one by evening. No coat came home from that water. No button off any coat came home either, not one single small thing a child could have kept in a pocket and pressed warm between her fingers on a hard night. The lake kept what it kept, and it never once apologised for keeping it. And this account will not pretend otherwise now, at the very end, any more than it pretended otherwise at the beginning. Set beside that water just as plainly 2 signatures, a mother's, standing alone on a land receipt in a winter office 12 years before this wedding morning, a daughter's, standing alone on a wage contract in a schoolhouse 2 years before it. Neither woman had anybody else's name to lean on when she set her own down. Both walked out the far side of a stranger's desk holding paper instead of a refusal. That is the whole of what this family had to leave behind as proof of anything, and it turned out, quietly, to be enough. A lake that gave nothing back. 2 signatures that gave everything they had. Between the 2 of them, a woman's whole calm, built rather than born, standing where a father once stood and could not stand any longer. You have kept this account company through 6 long winters and a wedding morning, and there is a kind of trust in that. Staying with a family whose feelings nobody wrote down, all the way to a stranger's own bed on whatever night has found you tonight. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour has settled over your own house, thank you for spending it here, with a girl who lost a father to a lake and grew quietly into a woman who could stand in front of anybody and hold her own name steady. The lamp in this room is low now, same as it was in hers. Let your own eyes close whenever they are ready to, whether that is now, or 3 sentences from now, or already. Nothing left tonight asks anything more of you. The winter is over. The paper has said what it came to say. The rest of the night belongs to you and to your own bed, and to whatever quiet you have earned for yourself by staying this long. Good night,